And so the goalpost paradigm is shifting completely to a state where, well, defending successfully would be a good result, and the bad result if Ukraine doesn't get like the ammunition it needs to continue shooting at the Russians who are advancing, and B, if they don't get the financial aid they need to continue to run the state properly, then the other scenario becomes possible where either Ukraine's military or Ukraine's state apparatus could really suffer to the point of collapsing, and to the point where Russia is given the opportunity to go forward and take any given amount of Ukrainian territory.
This is a conversation with Francis Farrel, an Australian-born journalist based in Ukraine, who works as a reporter focusing on the war and often reporting directly from the front lines. He works for the Kyiv Independent, which is a major Ukrainian English-language newspaper. And in this conversation, we talked about what does the situation on the ground in Ukraine look like today? What's the strategy for 2024? How long can Ukraine last without further Western military aid? And whether Ukrainian journalists should be publishing even negative stories about their own country at a time of war. If you're not already familiar with the Kyiv Independent, I suggest that you check it out, because it's a great source of information directly from Ukraine. And I also recommend that you start following Francis on Twitter, because he shares some pretty interesting stuff. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, good to be here.
So I think I'd like to start by sort of talking what is the mood like on the ground in Ukraine, because when you read many of the Western media, the narrative recently has taken a pretty dark, sort of negative turn, and sometimes reading these stories and reports, it can seem sort of hopeless. And I was wondering if the situation in Ukraine or the mood in Ukraine, whether among soldiers or regular people, is the same, or is it any different?
Yeah, so it's I guess a good question, but a kind of tricky one to answer, because objectively at the moment in Ukraine, we're at a bit of a crossroads, like a fork in the road. It's kind of hard to necessarily immediately imagine what this year could bring. So with that uncertainty comes a certain level of anxiety, and for many people, of course, it's an interesting comparison to a year ago, because a year ago we were also in the middle of winter, and we had these Russian missile and drone strikes taking out the energy infrastructure. So everyone was like living with this constant schedule of having blackouts regularly, not having electricity. For some people, not having electricity meant not having water. But on the battlefield, there was this incredibly brutal battle for Bakhmut happening, but there was this understanding that, okay, Ukraine needs to hold out and hold the fortress in Bakhmut for as long as possible. But all of this is leading towards opening a window for Ukraine to go on the offensive and liberate a lot of territory and potentially have a path straight to victory in the war. Whereas this year, we had that offensive and it was disappointing. It didn't go very far, and everyone, I think, is pretty open at this point about the fact that there is no immediate perspective of the chance of doing that again more successfully in the near future. In fact, it's the other way around. It's Russia which has the initiative. It's Russia that's attacking in several parts of the front line. And it's about defending Ukraine at this point. And that is very much obviously threatened by the threat of the US specifically, also the European Union with their own funding problems, but the US not passing the next funding packages, which would enable it to keep delivering ammunitions and weapons to Ukraine, which obviously makes a huge difference. And so we've read recently about that not arriving, and how that affects the amount of ammunition that Ukrainians have to work with on the battlefield. Now Russia has really taken the advantage in ammunition while Ukraine had it back in summer. And so everyone's just kind of sitting tight and waiting to see, I guess, how things will unfold going forward, because it's just not quite clear yet. And I think most people just mentally understand that they'll be ready to respond to the new reality once we know what it is. But for now, it's not quite clear.
So you've mentioned a lot of things that I want to talk about in more detail, but I think a good way to start would be sort of what are the expectations for 2024 for this year, and what seems that the Ukrainian strategy, both on the military and the political front, is going to be?
So I think the strategy here is going to be very much defined by necessity, and it's you could probably pretty easily boil it down to something quite simple, which is that the strategy is to defend effectively, as effectively as possible, because I mean, war is a very complicated thing, but within that complexity, you can boil it down to some simple things that have been proven to be the case over the whole full-scale war. And one of those things is that attacking and taking territory is much harder than defending, and is much more costly. And so now it's clear that Ukraine had a big chance to attack. They had a lot of resources that they pulled up, they gathered, new Western equipment, new NATO trained brigades, and so on and so on. But that wasn't enough. There were mistakes made on the Ukrainian side, and you could definitely argue that there wasn't enough given by the West to probably supply this offensive, air power, and so on, line clearing equipment. And it didn't work. It didn't break through these Russian defensive lines that had been preparing. And it's hard to see a scenario, especially given the situation with funding and Western aid. It's hard to see a scenario in the near future where Ukraine could in any way be able to gather the ammunition, the resources, and find from some magic location a new source of highly trained, highly motivated soldiers who are ready to go. I mean, they have their experienced brigades, but they're busy fighting, ready to go for another large scale offensive. So, and we see that Russia was very happy to take back the initiative. They didn't waste any time. Pretty much as soon as it was clear that the Ukrainian southern offensive wasn't going anywhere, they began this incredibly high intensity offensive on Avdiivka, which is still going on, although it's lowered in intensity a little bit since then. And they're also attacking in other parts of the front line, so near Bakhmut, near Kupiansk in the north, and also further south near Marinka. So you can see that they are very confident of their ability to now go forward. So far, they haven't had too many gains themselves, and we're going into winter, but looking into spring, where things will speed up a little bit, and then summer, it's clear that they are not content with sitting where they are on the front line. They want to now take their turn to go forward, and that means it's Ukraine's job to defend, and to defend in a way that that it inflicts the most attrition on their enemy, and saves and holds their own territory, and saves the lives of their soldiers. So in that respect, I think strategy is pretty simple for now. Of course, parallel to that, you have a lot of plans and aims to do more long-range strikes, for example, in Crimea, potentially other locations in Russia. But again, that depends a lot on what they receive from the West. There's always talk about ATACMS and Taurus at the moment, which would be huge if they could strike the bridge and all the targets in Crimea as much as they want. And then of course there's a separate war going on, which is the war of innovation. That's what Zelensky talked about, which in his Economist article a few months ago, which is basically trying to find a way to gain a technological edge, which could give Ukraine the advantage in this kind of brutal modern trench warfare. So you've got both sides innovating at breakneck speed when it comes to drones, and then when it comes to countering drones, both sides are working on their electronic warfare. So if, it's kind of behind the front lines, but that's another separate war that's going on, and the strategy, well, is definitely to try and get an advantage there in a way that could potentially change the game on the front line. But for now, it's definitely Ukraine will be in defense for the foreseeable future.
And talking about defense, does it seem like Ukraine's in a good position for it? The reason I'm asking is that you've yourself spoken a while ago about the fact that Ukraine may be underestimated some aspects of it. I know you talked about how it hasn't prepared as many lines of defense and as many lines of trenches in the territories that are going to be highly contested as it maybe should have. And perhaps it seems like Ukraine wasn't expecting that it would go on defense this year.
Yeah, so that's it's a bit of a personal obsession of mine, the question of fortified defense lines, because the practice that we've seen in this war so far has shown how effective they are. They, I think, were the main factor in stopping stopping the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so I was talking to people who were in that 47th Brigade, trying to pierce through those defensive lines in the south, and they were telling me, like, there's one thing what we can see from the satellite, from the sky. You see these big trenches, the ditches, the dragon's teeth, but then you actually reach the lines, and there are underground systems, there are interconnected tunnels, there are concrete reinforced bunkers. And he was saying no one is as good at digging in and fortifying as the Russians are. And they did it in a very smart way, because while they had the initiative attacking around Bakhmut, they used that time effectively to prepare for what they knew would be the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And Ukraine did not do that while they were attacking over summer. And of course, this is a tricky one, because it's very tied into the political optics of such a decision and the messaging of it. Because if your outward narrative and aim, which is, I think everyone agrees that's a just and the right aim to have, is to go forward and to liberate all the occupied territories of Ukraine, then if you suddenly start digging huge concrete reinforced defensive lines, at intervals 5, 10, 15 kilometers back from the front line in the territory that you're controlling, that doesn't suggest much of an intention to go forward. It suggests that you're slowly preparing for the conflict to perhaps even freeze along this line. But on the other hand, again, military strategy dictates that at this point there are no clear roadmaps for Ukraine to go forward. And so every scenario, even just having the best chance possible for Ukraine to go forward in the future, it all begins with an effective defense and maximum attrition of Russian forces who are attacking, and minimum, while taking minimum losses in territory and equipment and men. And when it comes to how you can dig into the ground, it makes such a big difference for the lives of your soldiers. If you just imagine a soldier defending a trench line, which is almost difficult to doesn't even resemble a trench at this point, because it's just being dug very quickly into the ground with shovels and being blown up by artillery consistently over many weeks, compared to an infantryman sitting behind prepared lines of defenses where they've got minefields in front of them. They've got dragon's teeth. They've got anti-tank ditches, and they're sitting in a prepared, concrete reinforced dugout with, they're able to sleep properly. They're able to keep warm properly. It makes a huge difference. And unfortunately, if you take, for example, the area north of Avdiivka, where soldiers have told me that, these prepared defense lines haven't been dug and they don't really exist. Now, they're still holding the line despite not having these defensive lines to hold. They're still holding these basic blown apart positions, but they're forced to do it with so much more effort and higher casualties. So that's I think one of the issues that we see now, and I think it's just taken time for Ukraine to adjust and realize that this is an absolute necessity to do. I think it's also a difficult thing to implement when you don't have the direct power vertical structure that Russia has, because digging these defensive lines requires state resources, requires civilian construction companies to get involved. So you can't just ask the military to dig these huge, impressive fortifications. And it requires a lot of coordination between the civilian and military leadership of the country, which unfortunately is faltering a little bit with all this Zelensky, Zaluzhny stuff. But I have hopes that now there's new focus and that they understand how important this is, and we'll see over the next weeks and months if that translates to something actually being built on the front line.
Well, you've touched on one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because it seems from what you're saying about the trenches or the lines of defense is that the military strategy is not really aligned with the political goals of the civilian political leadership. And that's obviously has been a topic of a lot of interest in the West as well. And I am wondering if this is sort of the lines of defense is one example, but is the military civilian or the military political rift, is it becoming more of an issue that actually has practical consequences, or is it sort of overblown and maybe exaggerated for the sake of drama?
I think the basic idea that Zelensky and Zaluzhny are not best friends, and Zelensky maybe perhaps sees a bit of a political threat in Zaluzhny. It's grounded in reality. I know that from different places, but at the same time, it's about these people's ability to put that aside and come together and talk and make the most important decisions for the country. So defense lines is one example, and it's good to see there that you have the ministries involved, from the digital transformation ministry, the defense ministry, and infrastructure ministry, and they'll be talking to the general staff about how to go about defense lines. At Zaluzhny's press conference, the defense minister Umerov was there, and you could see that they had a cordial, quite friendly relationship, and they've been they've had photos taken of them, and they seem to get along. So, like, when it comes to making these important decisions, I think in general there might have been a period of drift and people losing focus and personal issues getting in the way. But now I think I'm confident that they'll get back on track. Zelensky himself is a more tricky one, because you can see that in his press conference as well. You could see that he has got his political image on his mind a lot when it comes to the questions he's answered, and he did put quite a lot of responsibility, which should have been his responsibility as supreme commander-in-chief, onto the military or onto other state bodies. But we'll see. An interesting example is the current debate over mobilization. And again, that plays into a lot of the similar dynamics because the military just needs people. And, I think everyone agrees with that, but it's about how many and how they get those people. Uh, and, and for the politicians who now have to vote for a draft law in Parliament about expanding the eligibility and changing the rules for mobilization, then it's now in their hands to take that decision. But they're also worried about politics. They're worried about the reaction of the people, their electorate, and so you can see that dynamic surfacing in the mobilization question as well.
I definitely want to talk about mobilization as well a bit later on. But just to follow up on the sort of rift between Zelensky and Zelensky, I've heard that Zelensky is afraid of sort of seeing Zelensky as a political competition. But has Zelensky actually ever, Zelensky, the chief of Ukrainian staff, head of Ukrainian military, has he ever expressed any kind of desire to go into politics? Or I wonder, where is that perception of threat from him coming from?
The short answer is no. He hasn't really. Every time he speaks in an interview, it's always fully focused on the military situation. And but the fact is that objectively in the country, because of his role and because of the country's huge respect for and trust in the military, for defending their country, it, it they just naturally they naturally consider him such a trusted public figure that it's impossible for these questions not to come up, even if he has no intention of it. One thing he hasn't done, he hasn't come out and said, no, politics doesn't interest me at all. I never want to run for some kind of civilian office. He hasn't done that, but he hasn't indicated that he wants to. But unfortunately, in Ukraine, you do have polls and trust ratings and things like that. And so I think it's just almost ingrained in the political psyche and thinking of anyone involved in Ukrainian politics, especially at the highest level, to take notice of these. And it makes sense that then, Zelensky, someone like that, could be potentially seen as a threat, because where we are in, this started at the end of 2023, and now in 2024 it's going to be more and more a thing. Even if we don't have elections in Ukraine, what we are seeing is the return of political competition, and that's just inevitable because you have a civilian government, and while they at first and president, while they at first everyone united and everyone seemed to be just completely focused on making the right decisions, then with time questions begin to arise. You can see questions begin to arise about mistakes that are made, or bad decisions, or corruption that is happening, and corruption that is being kind of protected by the top leadership of the country. And it's normal for that to result in increased scrutiny and increased murmurs from people that, like, no, he's not doing a good job, for example, which it's the hardest job in the world at the moment. I think that's just what people could start commenting. You see social media, you see people complaining about this issue or that, and so it's just natural that eventually some kind of open political discussion and competition returns, but it's all in the context of, well, we can't let this get too ugly because we have a war to fight. Whereas in Zelensky's case, it's kind of, his job is easier because he can just do his job and focus on the war. And in the sense, he benefits politically from that, but it's not clear he would want to actually do anything with that popularity.
I think talking about the polls, that's an interesting issue because the approval or support for Zelensky has dropped quite a lot since the peak at the beginning of the invasion. And I think that's quite hard or not entirely clear on exactly why that happened. As you said, he obviously is in a complicated position. And I wonder if it's because people don't see his government as exactly competent, or if it's because of the corruption scandals, or if they blame him for the war not going as well as maybe some would expect, or what seems to be the reason for this drop of support?
At the end of the day, yeah, it's hard to pinpoint just one reason. I think if you could make it just one reason, a broad one, I think top one would be corruption. Would because, and again, there was a period of unity for perhaps almost the first year of the full-scale war, more or less all of 2022, where this wasn't really talked about very much. In even in the media, there was perhaps a fair amount of self-censorship because everyone's thinking about the consequences of going public with a certain corruption story. But and it's a very good thing that this happened. Eventually, we got to the point where media would publish stories about this, and people would start talking about them openly, because that's accountability, and when money is stolen from either government budget or perhaps military procurement contracts, there's a very sharp understanding that probably results in lives being lost on the battlefield. And so and here you have questions of responsibility, like who's the corrupt one, and on which level is local government, or which level military command or ministry, and is, of course, objectively, responsibility can't always be with the very top, systemically. But when it comes to, for example, the budgets of ministries, of the defense ministry, for example, procuring food at overinflated prices. I mean, that scandal came out around a year ago with these eggs that were three times as expensive as they should have been, and it took over 6 months for that to result in the defense minister being dismissed. And then there are other ministries. There's the question of the television marathon and how much money is spent there. The culture ministry making state-funded TV shows in times of war. And when it comes to a specific obvious thing that can be criticized, and for which Zelensky can be criticized and is done so very sharply, then it's often the corruption issue, and that's nothing new for Ukraine. It's the same in peacetime. Basically, almost every new president has promised to end corruption and disappointed, and that's why there's this constant turnover. But then there are other things as well. Again, and we could talk about that, about mobilization, about people's perception in general of how he's handling the war.
Yeah, I think before we get to that, I wanted to talk about the foreign aid for a little bit. You've mentioned that there are two packages, one stuck in the European Commission and one in the U.S. Congress that Ukraine is dependent on, and hopefully both of them will go through eventually, but we don't know when, and we don't know exactly if that's actually going to happen. And I'm wondering what kind of or how big of an issue is the lack of this aid at the moment. And it's good to point out, it's not just military aid, but it's also financial aid for the state to continue functioning. And also, what is the public perception? How do Ukrainians see the fact that the Western aid is sort of being stalled for political reasons?
Yeah, obviously this is one of the most important and kind of one of the scariest issues that remains up in the air for now. And it's so important and scary because, again, it could result in a complete paradigm shift in this war, of course. So on the one hand, when only 6 months ago we were enjoying a nice summer in Ukraine, and there weren't actually that many missile strikes or anything. Never mind, of course, the Kherson disaster and all of that. But in general, we were all, used to the environment of the war and watching the counteroffensive carefully and having all our highest hopes that it would do well and could take back, liberate Melitopol and put pressure on Crimea, and this would be it. This is the path to victory. And if it doesn't go so well, then maybe the conflict the war will kind of freeze. There'll be some kind of military stalemate. The understanding was that Ukraine, as an independent state, and the vast majority of its territory still has been successfully defended and secured. And that's what foreign leaders were also saying. When they were still refusing to give key weapon systems, they would love to emphasize the fact that Russia will never Russia has failed, and Russia will never find victory in Ukraine, and so on and so on. But fast forward to now, when the counteroffensive has more or less failed, and Russia has taken the initiative, and this aid is up in the air. You have a situation where Russia's exact plan for their long-term vision, pathway to victory, is starting to be realized, because it was exactly about holding the territory that they've occupied already from Ukraine's offensives, attriting the Ukrainian army, even if it meant that their army was being attrited at a higher rate, because they could afford that. Giving themselves time to put the country onto a proper war footing. We have a third of the budget going to military now in Russia, and tiring out the West to the point where they are not able or willing to send Ukraine aid anymore. And everything according to that plan is happening so far. And so the goalpost, the paradigm is shifting completely to a state where, defending successfully would be a good result, and the bad result if Ukraine doesn't get the ammunition it needs to continue shooting at the Russians who are advancing, and B, if they don't get the financial aid they need to continue to run a state properly, then the other scenario becomes possible, where either Ukraine's military or Ukraine's state apparatus could really suffer to the point of collapsing, and to the point where Russia is given the opportunity to go forward and take any given amount of Ukrainian territory. And there are a lot of, obviously, limitations to that, because there are smart decisions being made, fortifications being dug. Now a lot of the artillery ammunition is being kind of superseded by FPV drones, which are more doable to produce independently of Western artillery. So Ukraine, without that, can in theory hang on for a decent amount of time, but long term is the bigger issue, and it's about holding out, I guess. Hopefully getting that passed in 2024 to hold out and maybe even have time for offensives. But then 2024 is when 2025 is when it gets really So it's going to be crunch time then, especially given of course, the US election, which I'm starting to believe now is one of the things that really could make or break this war.
Well, let's maybe talk about that a little bit, because it looks like at this point there is a very solid, or it's quite likely that Donald Trump could win and be reelected as the US president. And I guess, what are the perceptions in Ukraine of how that would affect the war if that would happen? I've heard reports of Ukrainian representatives. I think the Ukrainian foreign minister was talking about that it wouldn't actually be that bad because previously, when Trump was president, um, he was actually the one who sent some of the um, aid for the first time back then. But I'm wondering what's the general feeling in Ukraine surrounding this eventuality, and what would be your take on how that would affect the war?
Yeah, I know people are definitely worried about the possibility of a Trump presidency, and I think it's a very rational worry. The way he sympathizes with dictators, the way he doesn't really have a relationship with the truth or with just the basic Western values and the values regarding a rules-based world order that we've come to take for granted in the West. I mean, it's a big enough question for the Americans in their own country domestically, whether he's going to try and use that term with all the instruments in his power to take over and destroy America's own democracy. And so, in that context, the idea of let alone continue, yeah. Sorry, say that again. Yeah, in that. In that context, the hope that he will continue to fund Ukraine, which he said he won't. He said he'll stop the weapon, the military and financial aid, and force them to negotiate, which of course makes zero sense whatsoever. It's not a bright future, but I mean, people like the foreign minister, they can't say that openly. They can't ruin the relationship immediately in advance with the person who their survival is going to be in the hands of. So I think a little potential optimistic side where there could be some truth in what Foreign Minister Kuleba said in this regard is that if we do have a Trump presidency, but he doesn't become, he just does his own thing for another 4 years, but he doesn't try to hijack U.S. democracy, and he's not this completely unhinged leader, then the potential consequences of Ukraine actually losing the war, collapsing, Russia advancing forward, taking big cities, Kharkiv, Kyiv, like that disaster scenario for the West geopolitically could be enough to put pressure on Trump to stop it. So, I mean, it's just weird talking about all of this completely speculatively. But when I do think about it, I think in those frameworks, good scenario of him eventually being convinced that, okay, you do have to continue this support. The bad scenario in which he's already trying to hijack the US itself, let alone worry about Ukraine, and a kind of middle scenario where as much as he might like to abandon Ukraine personally, the reality of what this would mean for the US, the West, and the world would just mean something stops him from abandoning them completely. Yeah.
And there's also a chance that maybe he's not going to end up being president in the end, but we'll have to see about that. There's one more thing I want to talk about, or one of the things I want to talk about is mobilization that we've already mentioned, the potential for another major round of mobilization. And I've heard that it's maybe the biggest topic domestically in Ukraine at the moment. And I'm wondering, like, first, is that true? Is it really that big of an issue domestically within Ukraine? But also, how badly does Ukraine actually need more soldiers right now? How many of them does it need? And is it really that unpopular, another round of mobilization? I think, especially when you compare it with the willingness of Ukrainians to sign up and go join the military in the beginning of invasion, I think the turn of it now being such an unpopular decision is a little surprising.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with the mobilization question. So I'll start, I guess. First of all, there's an obvious need, right? That there's no getting around the need to mobilize potentially hundreds of thousands more men over the year. It's worth remembering that mobilization in Ukraine doesn't really happen in rounds like it did in Russia. Like, there was a big round and they needed 300,000 people, and then since then they might like to do another big round, but in the meantime they've been getting by using prisoners and contract soldiers and a bit of mobilization here and there. But in Ukraine, there's been there's been mobilization from the start, and it's just a rolling process. So what's being discussed now is expanding the eligibility and expanding the kind of tools possible for the government and military, the defense ministry, to mobilize people in the aim of reaching a certain target. And there was this number that Zelensky said, for 50 to 500,000 soldiers for the next year. And then Zelensky said, no, we didn't specify that specific number, but the number sounds potentially about right. It's very hard to predict. It depends a lot on the dynamics of the war over the next year. Of course, again, if Ukraine is able to set up a very effective defense, and they're supplied enough with the weapons and ammunition they need, they might need a lot less people. Then there's the question of demobilization. So is it possible at this point to put into law that mobilized soldiers have an end date for their service, which on one hand is, on a human level, a very just thing, and I think something that most Ukrainians would support, especially those whose family and friends are out there serving. On the other hand, it's a huge headache for the military, because you're losing soldiers with, if you're discharging them, eventually you're losing soldiers with a lot of military experience, and they need to be replaced by more mobilized soldiers who have no experience. So it's incredibly tricky. It is indeed the biggest topic in Ukraine at the moment, 100%, and it's not unpopular per se. Like, people understand the need. There are very few people who are now trying to raise their voices and saying, that's enough. I've had enough of this mobilization. The country just needs to stop the war, or whatever, like something like that. People understand the need, but it's about how it's done and how it's implemented. And there are a lot of issues, to be honest. So the main one, I think, is the reputation of the local recruiting centers all over the country. So there are always these videos popping up of recruiting officers just grabbing people on the street who refuse to cooperate, throwing them into a bus, and then already within 72 hours they're at the training center. Of course, and they also have a huge reputation for corruption, because if someone doesn't want that fate, they might be able to solve it with money. So those people have the most unenviable job in the world. It's really dirty work, but they make it more dirty with the practices that they often carry out. And so, and then you have a kind of higher level political context when it comes to corruption. People talking about the business elites not being mobilized, the MPs and their children not being mobilized, which is not always the case. Some MPs are actually fighting, but there are concerns there, corruption at a large level. Like, why would I be happy to send my son to the army when it's clear that the military is still not able to even supply him with a proper bulletproof vest, and we have to go buy that or raise the funds ourselves. So the overall state of the military also has an effect on this, and it's tricky. So at the moment, I think we are at a point where this new draft law with the new rules will be read in the parliament in the next few days, and we'll see if there's a lot of political games in terms of the terms of that. But I think that the mobilization issue is summed up most best by what Zelensky said at his press conference, which was just in many different formulations. He was just saying, we don't want to do any of this, but this is what we need to do. We need these people to what?
I think one more thing I'd like to talk about is moving away from the practicalities of the war for a little bit and towards more ethical issues. And that's because I've seen an editorial that was published by your newspaper, the Kyiv Independent, that was basically reacted to in the editorial. The newspaper was reacting to criticism for being too critical and publishing too many negative stories about Ukraine, its performance in the war, corruption, and so on. And in the editorial, you have claimed that it's important to keep publishing bad news as well as good ones, even in times of war. And I thought that was a really interesting topic, because the same discussions are sort of had in other countries and in other newspapers when it comes to reporting on Ukraine. And I think in Ukraine it must be even more sensitive and closer to the heart. And I guess, how do you see that debate, and where do you stand on the issue of finding a balance between sort of reporting objectively what journalism should do and how it should work at a regular time, and trying to not to be too demoralizing when times are already really tough and you don't want to make it even worse?
Sure. So in this respect, Kyiv Independent specifically is in a very unique position, because we are a Ukrainian media outlet, but our audience is predominantly not in Ukraine. So it's not for the Ukrainian domestic audience. It's not for all kinds of ordinary Ukrainians to read an article and start a conversation about this or that. There are lots of good Ukrainian media who already do this, and it's worth noting that when it comes to issues, political issues, corruption, and so on, there are plenty of Ukrainian media, which had a long reputation of solid investigative work, just solid reporting in general, who are not shying away from this stuff, and who we go ahead with it, even though they might receive criticism themselves for it. And there's a very active debate because some people in Ukraine have a very strong respect for the importance of true independent journalism, especially if you compare it to the television marathon, the United Television channel that you have in Ukraine, which fewer and fewer people watch because they understand that that's just, it doesn't really, it's not very, it's not a nutritional media news product. It doesn't tell them much of worth, where you do have alternatives, whether it's independent Ukrainian media or Telegram channels that people trust. So people want to hear the news, but sometimes other people, perhaps the military or government officials, make the argument that this or that outlet is kind of going too far in that respect. It's hurting morale. But our audience is a foreign one, so we're kind of a voice for Ukraine for the outside world, and in that respect, most of our audience are already very big fans of Ukraine, very big supporters of Ukraine, but also potentially decision makers, professionals, analysts who are involved with Ukraine on a daily basis will read our work. And so for them, it's a funny one because, yeah, we do have an impact in that sense, but the vast majority of our readers are often just ordinary people who feel very strongly about Ukraine. So they might have certain opinions. Generally, for me, and I think any journalist who's working in Ukraine, especially in Ukrainian media, the thought does come up into your head when you're coming up with a story, looking for something interesting to write about, or maybe you hear something really scandalous and controversial. The thought does come up like, okay, if I write about this, like, could this really damage Ukraine's state in war for one reason or the other? In general, like, my personal position on this whole matter is that something that is incredibly important and something that has defined the way this war has been fought on both sides has been connection with reality, grasp of reality. You could see how that was lacking on the Russian side when they first launched the full-scale invasion. They had a completely skewed idea of what Ukraine was and how Ukraine would respond. And they were mocked for it, and they're consistently mocked. When they talk in their military briefings about, instead of suffering a big defeat, they just kind of transferred forces out of Izium, out of Kherson. Everyone has a good time laughing at that, laughing about how they destroyed 500% more HIMARS than were ever given to Ukraine or anything like that. But, it's Ukrainians and the Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian people and supporters of Ukraine outside are not immune to falling into the same trap. When you come to just really enjoy news about stupid Russians failing and the smart, wily, brave Ukrainians smashing the little fronts, if the reality starts to be not that, then people can get disappointed and potentially say that this is demoralizing, when it's just actually something they don't want to hear themselves. When it comes to demoralizing and when it comes to grasp of reality, my experience is that nobody has a better grasp on reality than the soldiers themselves. And so it's not them that I would worry too much about. But in the meantime, for those who are supporting, whether they're decision makers or just passive supporters, understanding the truth is absolutely paramount.
I think that's a really good answer to a quite complicated question. I think the final thing I would ask is that since our conversation has been a little negative and a little dark, since the situation is not easy at the moment, I'm wondering if you have any good news to share on what's happening right now, so that we can end, and that perhaps have not received as much attention as it would deserve, so that we can end it on a more of a positive note.
Sure, sure. The active quest to end on a positive note. But yeah, there's good news in the sense that the fundamental, basic alignment of what's going on in this war of soldiers fighting without question for their country, even if they're fighting near Bakhmut, knowing that if they don't fight near Bakhmut, they'll be fighting near Lviv instead. And yeah, they're tired and whatnot, but they are not at breaking point, I would say. And I think more or less they're being led by competent people. And the same goes for the people of Ukraine themselves. Again, nothing fundamental has changed about that understanding that we are still in the fight of our lives, and people need to chip in and contribute for to kind of hold on to their country and their freedom and their values. I guess one kind of interesting statistic was that, in a lot of, I don't know, one topic that's not talked about much in the West, and I think very few people outside Ukraine fully appreciate, is the culture of donations among ordinary Ukrainians. People talk about, oh yes, unfortunately volunteers and funds need to pay for bulletproof vests and drones and cars. But what lies behind that is widespread, incredibly generous culture of people who are already in a very tricky economy, not earning much money, but still understanding the personal duty to donate to help their soldiers fight on the front line, and you see that just everywhere in social media. If you're in Ukraine, they're just constantly posting these fundraisers. Everyone needs more drones, more cars, more equipment, and for a while there was a kind of idea, a feeling that the people were getting complacent and that the donations were beginning to drop and these fundraisers were beginning to move more and more slowly. But then something interesting happened and people kept getting more creative. So they would make funny videos or songs to draw people to donate. But more importantly, they would, if there was a large amount of money that needed to be donated, say 50,000 euros or something like that, they would take their friends and they would all split it up, and each friend would need to raise 1,000 each or 500 each. They would all donate to each other, and this money could be eventually raised pretty quickly. And finally, the country's online bank, Monobank, which creates the infrastructure for most of these fundraisers, because they have a mechanism where you can have a jar and you click a link and it's very easy to donate. So most donations go through Monobank. They actually showed that in the past few months, donations are actually going up. So the people, in the end, I think that's the best. People's bank account, people's wallet is the best indication of how seriously they take this war and this fight for existence. And those numbers just prove that no one's ready to let go anytime soon or anything like that.
I'm happy to hear that. Okay, so thank you so much for the conversation. It was really interesting. And yeah, thank you for the work that you're doing in Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.